Good afternoon. I'm delighted that you could join us here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Museum. My name is Eric Patterson. I serve as president and CEO. On behalf of our whole team, we're so thrilled that you could join us really for two events that intersect this week. One for commentary on the 75th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty and the NATO summit, and simultaneously the beginning of Captive Nations Week. Let me say a few words about what we're going to be hearing from experts about today, and then a few housekeeping items. First, going into this week, few would have guessed just 6 or 8 weeks ago the level of uncertainty, at least some quarters, about what might happen at the NATO summit. No one was expecting a British snap election that was called the last week of May. No one was expecting the French president a week later to call a snap election. No one predicted the outcomes of the European parliamentary elections that went quite different than most analysts' expectations. On the other hand, the last year has seen in NATO a greater sense of complementarity, a greater sense of resolve, increased defense spending, and the advent of 2 new NATO members for the first time in many years. And so going into this NATO summit, there were many questions, but I think there was also a high level of resolve. At the same time, going into the next week, we in the US celebrate what's called Captive Nations Week. Going back to congressional legislation in the 1950s, and with presidential annual proclamations that go back to 1959. So every president from Eisenhower through President Biden, the United States recognizes those national groups that have been held in captivity. First under Soviet domination, so Poles and Romanians and Lithuanians and others. And then over time, a wider field, including those held in captivity in China, Cuba, and elsewhere. And so this intersection of thinking about NATO's response to Russian aggression and this idea that there are national groups around the world, but in particular in Eastern Europe, who continue to face the threat of armed domination by Moscow. This is the right time to be thinking about these issues. We'll follow the program fairly strictly today, first with a panel of distinguished foreign policy and defense experts, and then a short interview, and then a second panel. You'll notice that in your schedule that there are no breaks. So if you need an opportunity to refresh yourself or something to drink, you can just step right out into the other room and move back and forth that way. An event like this couldn't happen without the help of sponsors, and we've listed the sponsors of this event on the back. We're deeply grateful for their assistance in this. We will take questions for short question and answer times, but the way we'll do that is that you'll receive or have received a 3x5 card to write your question on. And during the third speaker of each panel, we will collect those, and then those will be provided to the moderator for a short question and answer time. Well, with those opening remarks, allow me to introduce the moderator for our first panel, the Honorable Bruce Weinrod, who served as the defense advisor to the U.S. mission at NATO, and for a time as the acting U.S. ambassador to NATO under President George W. Bush. Previously, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy under President George H.W. Bush. Bruce, I hand the microphone over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm speaking in the microphone. Anyway, thank you, Eric, and thank you all for coming. Several of us here are actually trustees of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and we're even more pleased to be able to be a part of this event. Let me start out by just saying that the first session, as you can see, is entitled Captive Nations, From Captive Nations to a United Alliance. And in our conversation, which will be brief for each of us, we'll talk about some dimensions of the past, the present, and the future. And this is particularly timely because, of course, we have a NATO summit and a communique. And I myself worked 2 of these communiques in the past. And they tell us something, but not everything, about what will happen, because these are words. They have to be followed up in the capitals and in Brussels with action. So we hope that will be the case. So we're fortunate to have panelists who have extremely deep and lengthy experience dealing with European and NATO and other issues for the region east of NATO. And they're all, as I said, going to have brief remarks, and then we'll open up for discussion. So let me, I'm going to introduce one at a time as they speak, and fuller biographies you can find in a program, I'm told. So first, I'd like to ask Honorable Paula Dobriansky, Ambassador Dobriansky, who you can see was, among other things, Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs for, I think, 8 years.
Yes.
The longest serving undersecretary in American history, among other things. And it would take me quite a while to go into everything, but Paula, could you please give us your thoughts?
You have to share that mic. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And let me first thank Eric, you, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation team for holding this event, and also piggybacking it on the NATO summit, which I know you have. My role is to very briefly define captive nations and what it means, because this is the month when Captive Nations Week is recognized. So going back to July 17, 1959, the Senate Resolution 111 was passed on that day and signed into Public Law 8690. And significantly, that particular legislation has virtually been acted upon by every president, starting with President Eisenhower right up to the present time. In other words, every president has issued a proclamation. It happens to be the third week of July. We're doing it a little bit earlier to connect with the NATO summit and the many distinguished visitors in town, but it's the third week of July. I would like to also mention, if I may, my father, actually, Dr. Lev Dobriansky, who David Keene knows and remembers. There may be others here too, who I know, Sven Kramer, among others. My dad was the one who penned that resolution, which became Public Law 8690. What's its purpose? Its purpose is basically to spotlight and condemn the continued suffering of those victimized nations and people living under communism. And the interesting thing about it is, up to this day, there are some who, by the way, are free now, but there are others that we know are not. And in fact, VOC recorded that 1/5 of the world's population still remains subjected to tyrannical communist rule. The message here is that we must not forget, in this case, what those individuals lived under, and for those who are still in it, to ensure that we are in the fight with them. Here, I want to give 2 quotes and then just my end comment and then pass the mic. John F. Kennedy had a statement which I think was very relevant. He said, quote, "We must keep alive the hopes of freedom of the peoples of the captive nations." Well, we know that was true not only in 1959 when this started, but it's true to the very present day. Reagan, later, years later, said a similar thing. And it was interesting. He said, "Free people, if they are to remain free, must defend the liberty of others." I say this because I connected to what is happening today. The invasion of Ukraine, the attempt to absorb and take away the territorial integrity, the very integrity of what it means to be Ukrainian, is at stake now. And then we have also playing China in the Indo-Pacific, Cuba, Frank Calzone is here, others are here, Venezuela. I could go on and mentioning, and I'm not mentioning all, but the fact is that this concept was relevant then, it's very relevant today. And I'll end on this note and pass it to Aldona. Vice, you're going to introduce her, so I guess I'll pass the mic back to you. But I think it's important that it's also connected to what happened at the NATO summit. It was striking to me that at the NATO summit, and we'll hear more about it, that Russia, China were singled out in the declaration and for what they stand for. And that is a suppression and repression of freedom, fundamental freedoms.
Paula, thank you very much. That was just really helpful in understanding the history of the captive nations movement. I'd like to next ask Ambassador Aldona Vosh, who is was formerly ambassador to Estonia and is the president of a great educational institution called the Institute for World Politics, to offer her comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Trustee Weinrod, and thank you very much, Victims of Communism, for inviting me to speak today. So, captive nations, for me personally, is extremely meaningful because I was a captive in a captive nation. Growing up in communist-occupied Poland, I may not have as a child fully understood what someday it would be a blessing to live in freedom. But even as a small child, I knew that something was wrong. Something was truly evil. Because simply put, communism is against human nature. Communism is simply a lie. So, as a child, I remember asking my father why he kept his briefcase next to his bed versus keeping his briefcase by his desk, because our home was just immaculate. And he answered, so that I have all our important documents right by me in case we have to leave quickly. So later on in life, as a graduate student, I experienced firsthand the failed communist economic policies. If you had the funds, my goodness, you could buy the best Cuban cigars and the best Russian red champagne, and you could buy the best Russian vodka. But if you didn't have those funds to use on the black market, you were only allowed to purchase literally scraps of meat with a ration card that was issued by the government on a monthly basis. During that time period, there were lines for everything, from basic food products to toilet paper. In preparing my speech, and I apologize if I'll go over a minute, I researched, because I only remember, so I had to research data for a month. This is in the 1980s, so it's not in the 1880s. Okay, 1980s, dear students. You were only allowed to have 2.5 kilograms of meat to purchase a month. 2 kilograms of sugar a month. 1.3 kilograms of flour a month. 500 grams of butter a month. 2 bars of soap a month. And half a liter of vodka a month. So my family had an extensive history of resistance dating back over 100 years. Resistance to the German invasion in 2 world wars, to Nazi and subsequently Stalinist domination in our homeland. My father fighting for the freedom of his homeland, which was an independent country before the war. He was fighting in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He was disarmed and transported to Flossenburg concentration camp. He was prisoner number 23,407. My father survived because he was liberated by General Patton's United States Army, but only to return to his city to live under imposed communist rule. Now, ultimately, we were able to leave to find freedom and sanctuary in the United States. But though we were able to flee from communist-dominated Poland, we never gave up our ideas and our dream to see that our native country would once again regain its rightful re-independence and freedom. So today, people think of communism, especially the younger generation, of simply a really, really bad time in history. But realities are that the threat of communism remains and that mission freedom still continues. Everywhere in the world, the communists are still alive and they're well, principally in the People's Republic of China, where the mechanism of control, the sheer brainwashing, the prison camps, and the diktat of the Communist Party are as much of daily life as was when I was growing up. In Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and of course, North Korea, communist rulers continue to trample on the dreams and the inspiration of their people. And their people are still yearning for freedom. These countries are now captive in hostile ideologies of brutal strongmen. And to those strongmen, the idea of human liberty is actually an enemy, that idea. And it's an enemy that they fear. So I'm truly grateful now to be a trustee of the Victims of Communism and also to represent, to my students, IWP, the Institute of World Politics, which is a graduate school on national security, intelligence, and international affairs, where the ideas of freedom and the importance of Western moral tradition is taught every day at our graduate school. I am honored to publicly express this annual commitment to the values of democracy, freedom, human dignity, and the commitment that is as crucial to the world now as it has ever been. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For your deeply moving and eloquent remarks and very personal, we very much appreciate it. So I'd like to now ask our next speaker, DCM at the Czech Embassy, Jan Havranek. I hope I got it right. Good. And please.
Thank you. Very honored to be here. Thank you, Eric, and the entire team of the VOC Memorial Foundation. And it's very humbling and also challenging to go after the ambassadors and sort of bring us to the current situation and say a few words about the NATO. I spent 6 years at NATO headquarters, working also for the current Secretary General of NATO, and also I worked at the Czech Ministry of Defense in multiple roles. And was sent here to Washington, D.C. when the war in Ukraine started, because we felt it was very important to have people who have NATO experience and security experience and defense experience like myself working actually on the other important political front here in Washington, D.C. Now, a couple of points. I was not growing up in communism. In fact, most of my time I was growing up in what I would call a wild capitalism period, a period of forming capitalist society in former Czechoslovakia and Czech Republic subsequently, in a period of peace and in a period of seemingly calm, stable world. But of course, throughout my childhood and growing up and throughout my studies, I became more and more aware of conflicts and the fact that there are people who are not free all around the world. And this was also through, thanks to the legacy of our first post-communist president, Václav Havel, who was also very much an advocate of human rights, human dignity, freedoms, and who spoke on behalf of those who were not able to speak freely. But he was also the one who brought my country into NATO. And I think this is where the topic and the mission of the Memorial Foundation actually show how relevant it is in the context of today's meeting that are happening here in Washington, D.C., because values are at the very bedrock of the alliance. If you read the famous Washington Treaty. It's clearly written there. I will not be repeating it, but very often people are focusing on defense cooperation, Article 3, Article 5, collective defense. But if you read the preamble, it's, I would call it, the very best of United Nations agreed to democratic allies. And I want to really underline that NATO is a democratic alliance, despite some of the internal pressures and some of the internal tensions that we are facing. But I think it's a miracle that in times such as these, there are 32 nations and other partners who are able to come together and have a very firm stance on vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, more and more increasingly. And as we think about NATO for the future as an alliance of democratic allies who have subscribed to values, we really have to think about the others, and they have been already mentioned. Russia first and foremost, which is not a regional threat. I mean, Russia's ideology, conduct, etc., have very much impact on other countries, not only Europe and not only United States, but it's Russia that cooperates increasingly with China. It is China that enables Russia's holding the positions and still attacking Ukraine. It's Russia cooperating with one of the most hideous regimes in the world, in DPRK. It's a very mutually beneficial organization, and it's also Russia that is building factories with Iranian know-how, etc. So what I really see emerging on one side, and I would hate to talk about multipolar or bipolar worlds, but I really see emerging an alliance of like-minded Western, if you will, democratic countries who are also not regionally focused, but by this new definition of West, I also include countries such as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, South Korea. And you have the other part of the world, which is increasingly dominated by those who preach authoritarian regimes, communism, mix of various hideous ideologies, etc. So maybe as an introduction, I'll stop here, but I think overall NATO is in a great shape, despite the tensions, despite the question marks that we sometimes face. It's great that we get to celebrate it here in the capital of the United States, and it really shows the importance and significance of alliances. And thank you once again for hosting this.
Thank you very much, Jan. I would just offer a very few comments, elaborations. First, I had the privilege of being at NATO when Václav Havel came to give his speech there, which, if you want to read something that's brilliant and explains as well as anyone can what NATO is about, why it's important, I urge you to read that speech. Secondly, we can go into more detail, but this whole question of NATO enlargement to the east, the critics, the opponents were wrong at the time of the initial debate. They continue to be wrong. Enlargement has been a huge positive, and I'll just briefly point out that it encouraged stability in the region. All nations that were going to be interested in joining from the east had to forego any territorial claims, historic disputes with other nations. They had to develop a political process that was democratic, and that particularly including the area of civil-military relations. And they, in other words, had to have some true form of democracy. And that was clearly made as a precondition for any country wanting to enter. I was one of those who carried that message to them. Those countries wanted to enter NATO right away. And we had to say, wait a minute, you're going to need some years and some time to do the things necessary. And they did. And so the other point is, in terms of geopolitics, is if those nations had not joined, where do you think Russia and Putin might be today? That would be a region of instability instead of stability. And the problems that we have now and the challenges with Russia would be much further west. So that, I think, is very important to convey as a message. So let me conclude this opening discussion. And I think we then go into, if there are questions, or if we could also elaborate on our own comments. I'll turn it over to. Yeah, please.
When I gave my opening comments, I gave them briefly. I mentioned the fact that my own father, because we all have personal stories here, my own father was the author of Public Law 8690. But what I want to say is something that's important when one every year thinks about Captive Nations and Captive Nations Week. My father was a firm believer in the triumph of the human spirit, and that every human being, no matter where you are, wants to be living in freedom, to have your own liberty and space, and you're due that as a human being. And in that sense, he felt very definitively about that Ukraine would reacquire its independence. And I say that because most Ukrainians who look at the period of independence would say that there were two periods prior to the time of grand independence, if you will, that came to Ukraine. So my father lived to see Ukraine become independent again. I think if he were alive today, he would be devastated by what is happening and the fact of statements being made like President Putin saying that Ukraine is not a country. Ukrainians feel deeply about this. You'll be hearing from Ambassador Bill Taylor in the I think it's the second panel coming up. He knows Ukrainians feel very, very firmly about that. And there's a real difference now from the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbas region in 2014. At this time, Ukrainians feel very strongly about ensuring that they are able to maintain their country and their sovereignty and their identity. I just felt like saying that because on this occasion, when we come together here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, as I said, one of the most important elements is in terms of a strategy and having an impact. It's about education, which all of us are involved in, but it is also about taking acts and reminding. And in this sense, I was glad to see in this NATO summit that just took place, the fact that there were references not only to values, but also to the kinds of threats that we're confronting. And so in that sense, this is a time for continued action. It's not a time for complacency. That would be one of my core messages.
Thank you, Paul. Would either of you like to add anything, elaborate at this point? I can offer some comments, but Jan, do you?
No, I think what we've seen over the past 15 to 20 years is really this blurring of internal and external threats. And I think that's really important to underline. And you're absolutely right, Paula, that we're looking always at external threats. But since we're talking about authoritarian regimes, we really have to realize that through various hybrid means and tactics, they're important. They're exporting their policies, and they're trying to weaken us, free and democratic nations. So we are on the one hand vulnerable, but we're also very strong. But we have to continue to make our institutions stronger, not only through the international organizations, but also domestically. So I really want to highlight that in the future, I see a more and more increasing role in terms of what we now call resilience for NATO. Not only the European Union, not only our national institutions, but also NATO can play a significant role just to try to connect these two worlds together.
Thank you. By the way, just to add on in terms of the Czech Republic, when I was at in my first position at DOD, the first Gulf War took place. That was pre-NATO enlargement, but one of the countries that really stood up and took part was Czech Republic, and particularly with the chemical warfare detection capabilities, right? And by the way, at that time, people don't realize it was a coalition of the willing. It was not a NATO operation, and this is one of the many reasons why NATO has always been and continues to be important. 80 to 90% of the logistics for that conflict were borrowed from NATO. And I'm sure Ambassador Taylor, Bill Taylor knows, there's a quote that's attributed variously to General Bradley, General Eisenhower, and maybe even Mark Twain. I don't know, but it's amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And if you're in a military situation, you need the logistics, and that is something that NATO provides. So let me just turn it over to Ambassador Varshavy.
I wanted to make a point to what you said. And one of the things that we should notice is the domestic angle for the United States in reference to captive nations and being captive. So the idea in the United States, we actually are starting to be in current time a little bit captive, because we're starting to be captive in our cultural and partisan divide. And that is really extremely harmful to us collectively, because our adversaries are using that against us in order to continue to keep freedom away from others, and they are hoping to decrease the level of freedom that we have here. So there is a domestic way of looking at captivity.
Thank you.
Just to build on that, it's interesting, something that between the last administration, meaning the Trump administration, and the current administration, they put out national security strategies. And something that's common in both is the statement very clearly that we live in an era of great power competition. And when Aldona just said that, it reminded me, because you have the United States pitted against Russia and China, and then you have other players in this. Cuba, certainly, also North Korea, Iran, Venezuela to an extent in this case. But why I mention it is because, quite frankly, they're bound together because they want to diminish our own influence, and they also want to fragment our alliances, very much so. But the good thing that we should be thinking about on this occasion is the fact of how our countries in many ways have collaborated together. And let me give you an example, because we have Jan Hrvanik here. By the way, I don't know how many of you know, but the Czech Republic, we've worked through the Czech Republic countless times in our efforts in dealing through them in Cuba, because the Czech Republic has played a very front and pivotal and important role. And I know Frank Calzone, John Suarez, certainly know this fact. That kind of collaboration on behalf of freedom and on behalf of our common values is actually what this occasion is all about. Not forgetting and acting and collaborating together for those who want to have freedom and live in peace and freedom.
So I'd like to make a couple of additional comments. One is with respect to Ukraine, which is the subject of our next panel. The arguments that have been made that somehow NATO enlargement is the cause of Russia and Putin's invasion and attack on Ukraine is totally fallacious, wrong in every single way. I'm happy to send you articles that I've written on this subject, and I'm sure our next panel can go into that. But Mearsheimer and his crew are just don't understand the realities. Secondly, in terms of democratic values, I think it is worth reading. I brought it along, the charter, NATO charter, just this one little section, because it says it all. The NATO nations are determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. They seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. They are resolved to unite their efforts for collective defense and for the preservation of peace and security. That was true in 1948, 49, and it remains absolutely true today, which allows me to do one of my favorite things, bring up, there have always been opponents of NATO and the U.S. role in NATO, going back to Senator Taft, who voted with 13 others against our entry. George Kennan, who was very astute on the Soviet Union in general, but he was opposed to NATO U.S. membership and using military force. And then we have more recently so-called experts, Council on Foreign Relations expert Charles Kupchan in 2002 wrote, quote, NATO will fade away by 2010. And then there's a Professor Walt that some of you may have heard of. He said, quote, NATO does not have much of a future. It will become increasingly irrelevant. If it were to disappear, it would not matter very much. This was in 2010. Now, he's just written an article a couple of days ago. It's entitled, "This Time NATO is in Trouble for Real." So he doesn't give up. Finally, in one of the most stunningly ignorant and profoundly misguided statements I've ever encountered, Richard Haass, who was then president of the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote in the New York Times, quote, "If NATO did not exist, would anyone feel compelled to create it? The honest, if awkward answer is no," unquote. Well, just don't pay attention to the experts is what I would say. Last point is on NATO. It actually has become, in its inner core, a global democratic security network. When you have a NATO summit or even ministerials, you have Japan, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, South Korea, all represented. There are countries that NATO deals with that are not democracies, but there have been, even earlier in NATO's history, there were non-democracies. But in general, the thrust is toward democracy. And there is now this network, security network around the world that is exactly what you were referring to, which is needed to respond to the growing coalition of authoritarian autocracies.
Can I maybe briefly respond to some of the quotes? And I vaguely remember those. And I've met actually some of the professors and people, and it's a tough discussion because they have their own truth and vision. And I understand they have to make living and they have to be attractive to the market, etc. But if you look at NATO's history in the past 30 years, of course, the first 40, 45 years were more static. But throughout those past 30 years, NATO has over and over again reinvented itself. First, with the wars in the Balkans, with the fact that there were new members who were desiring to join the alliance. After 9/11, bringing in on the new tasks, and then in 2014, more and more increasingly focusing again on collective defense. And now, of course, with 2022 war, Russia's attack on Ukraine, we went back to the primary task, which is collective defense. But also, there are new models of cooperation emerging with almost like a membership type of cooperation with Ukraine that I guess the next panel will be talking about. But of course, the partners who are increasingly more attuned to the NATO world, but vice versa. So I think that's if someone were to define the next transatlantic bargain, it's really about the transatlantic allies as embodied in NATO, helping each other out on issues such as European security, but also security in the Indo-Pacific. We have questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
Questions.
Sure.
You have the questions, Bruce. Who has the questions?
Okay, great. Thank you. Read the handwriting here. Yeah, if you can read it.
I think it says, how do you reconcile the talk of democratic countries' dedication to freedom with the fact that the United States has the largest prison population in the world?
I think
You want to respond to that?
I think we'll move on to the next question.
Okay.
Uh,
Right. Are you concerned about younger generations forgetting or dismissing the tragedies caused by communism and repeating history? Even in the United States, embracing socialism has become mainstream. I think, Aldana, you should really respond to that because you also have been personally very engaged with this issue of education and looking at the next generation.
I'll start with my summary and then I'll pontificate. The summary, if you do not know history, there is no ability for you to interpret current events correctly to make the proper decisions for the future. It's not possible because history is fact. History is not a fiction or a feeling or a wish. History actually happened. They were facts. Good, the bad, the ugly, and the wonderful. You must know history. And if anyone thinks that communism or any form of almost communism is beneficial to the human being, they have no understanding of history. I can tell you for our college students, my father was and grandfather and great-grandfather were very patriotic. My entire family, aunts, uncles, grandmothers, everyone was in concentration camps. My mother was ripped from her mother's arms when she was in first to be taken as a slave, child slave labor during World War II. During World War I, my grandparents were taken as slaves from a free country to Germany. And I can tell you this, I would have never been allowed to enter the university under communist occupation, no matter how high my IQ was and how great my scores were on my entrance exams. Because my father was not in the Communist Party, I would have been forbidden from entering university. As an example, the students that were my peers who came from not the city had extra points to be admitted. The students who were my peers, whose parents were not educated, had extra points to be admitted, but I would have been forbidden for entering the university. Because I subsequently ended up in the United States, I'm a medical doctor. I'm one of the doctors who was saving everyone during the first World Trade Center bombing in New York. I gave back and I continue to give back to this country for the purpose of preserving freedom and human dignity, which can never be accomplished under socialism or communism. It's impossible.
The person who asked the question about prisons in the United States and then the issue about other countries, I'd like to take that on. I paused for a moment in this case. You're shaking. I don't know. That's your question? Was that your question? All right. Okay. So let me say it simply. You know, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has just entered the room and she's here. By the way, I was very struck. We were in a breakfast, I don't know, a month or so ago, and she shared with all of us that not only has she not been able to see her husband, who's in prison in Belarus, but nor has anybody else seen her husband in prison in Belarus. So what's the difference? I don't know what the number of prisoners in the United States, but what I do know, we have individuals who are in prison because they're convicted of crimes. Is our rule of law system, by the way, perfect? No, it's not. But you do have opportunities for appeal and reappeal. You do have paths. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes not. I'm not going to argue that it's perfect, but you know what I will say to you, and I will submit, and why, as President Reagan said, people from other countries want to come here. They're not flocking to Russia. They're not flocking to Cuba. They're not flocking to China. Why? Because they know that they have a better opportunity here for their livelihood. They also know that in terms of basic fundamental freedoms and respect for rule of law, it exists here. But going back to the core point, the thing about us, we're transparent, we're ever changing, and we're critical of ourselves. And in fact, whoever wrote that, I would submit to you that there are countless articles that criticize our rule of law system and how things should be improved. In fact, if I remember, you know, in the last administration, I believe during the Trump administration, actually, there was actually a whole issue about prison reform. There were some Americans who came to President Trump and said there should be some steps taken for prison reform. And I don't think that was out so much publicly, but I recall that happened. So simply, it's not the right question to ask, in my opinion. It's not about what the number is, because I bet you wouldn't even know what the accurate number of those who are imprisoned in Belarus or who are imprisoned in Cuba or who are imprisoned, you know, I could go on, in China, et cetera, et cetera. That's the issue.
Very well said, Paula. And I would just add, this, at least implicit in what you said is we have an independent judiciary, which
A free and fair and independent judiciary.
which those countries do not have. Okay, so we do have a question for Jan, which is what potential for actions do you see with small groups of like-minded NATO nations working together regarding support to Ukraine?
Well, there's been a lot happening already, and in fact, NATO is a larger alliance of 32 nations. We operate on consensus. Consensus is sometimes difficult to achieve, when I was working in NATO, there were 26 nations already in the room, and sometimes I felt, there's too much talking, but it is a democratic alliance and discussion is important and it's needed. And that's how we come to our decisions. But sometimes it really does take a group of allies who take an individual action and inspire the others. And in our assistance to Ukraine, this is what my country has been doing in the so-called ammunition initiative. We've been hosting various other coalition meetings, artillery coalition meetings, etc. So I don't think that coalition of the willing is a bad thing. It has this kind of a bad connotation when we talk about the conflicts of the past, but I think we've always been able to retain action. We've made mistakes sometimes, but I think it really is a model that NATO can work with from within, but also bringing in other partners. So I'm actually personally big believer in smaller coalitions, but that doesn't mean that NATO or other international organizations should stop operating. I mean, we're very much proud member of NATO, but it's through individual action and working closely with our Baltic countries, Danish, Dutch, and others on supporting Ukraine that we inspire the others within the alliance.
Thank you. I'm going to ask each one of you to have any small concluding remarks. So let me just say, my first time at the Pentagon, there were 16 nations at NATO. Second time, there were 20 some. And it's like if anybody's worked on the Hill, Senate side, any one senator can block or slow down or delay anything if they want to. Any one member of NATO can do the same. And it can take a long time you can usually work around it, but it's challenging, but it's worth it. It's worth it.
One thing that I will do say, as maybe a note of criticism, as you've all read, one partner, one ally has argued for an opt-out for certain financial assistance, and we're talking about Hungary. I don't think that's really the way forward. I mean, at this point, it was important maybe to keep the consensus and keep the main decisions going forward. But as a principle, I think that's really damaging for the future of the alliance. I think we all subscribe to the same principles, to the same treaty. Of course, everybody has their own national priorities, but opt-outs, I mean, we're not a European Union. I mean, NATO is not a European Union. So opt-outs are not really the way forward.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Let me ask if either of you have just some concluding thought that you'd like to offer.
I'll just say in conclusion first, how I began. I'd like to thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation really for bringing us together. You brought us 2 weeks ahead, but that's okay, of the actual time. But you did for a purpose and for a reason, clearly, of timing it with the NATO summit. But thank you for that, because as I said, every president since 1959, President Eisenhower, right to the present, has issued a proclamation. So have members of Congress. Why does that matter? It matters because it is part of education, and it is so that we keep this in the forefront of everyone's minds, domestically, internationally, policymakers, practitioners. It matters because we haven't done our job until literally there are no captive nations.
Thank you. I think that's wraps it up extremely well. And I will thank everybody for their participation. Thank the audience, and we'll conclude this panel.
Well, I'd just like to answer one question that was not asked by Ambassador Dobryansky. And why did we not wait 2 weeks? And of course, we held this at the same time as the NATO summit on the assumption that you would all be on vacation in 2 weeks, especially as how hot this summer has been. Well, we're going to transition to an interview, and I'm going to ask my guests to come forward. I think many of you have been inspired by the press accounts from Belarus in which citizen activists went out in the streets to block the government from allowing Russian troops to move through Belarus to Ukraine. I think you've also been inspired to see a woman stand up, first of all, as a partner, as a member of a family, and as a wife, and consistently demand, where are the political prisoners and where's my husband? Many of you know that in the 2020 election, that the leader of the opposition clearly won the election. International observers believe that she won the election. So our guest today, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, has become a global voice against tyranny. And we're very honored that you could join us here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So if you'll join me in the blue seats, we'll start this interview. I'm delighted that you could join us today. And our thoughts are with you and your family. But perhaps we could start at the larger aperture, and then we'll just work our way down. And would you comment on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and its destabilizing nature in the region?
So first of all, I'm living in this region, and believe me, till the very end, I couldn't imagine and believe, and I was persuading Belarusians, and Belarusians were persuading me that no, Russia will not dare to attack Ukraine, because we as Belarusians can't understand how so that neighboring country, invade our neighbors, because we Belarusians don't share imperialistic ambitions of Russia. We have different contexts. We are not the same. And in 2022, it became so evident that Belarusians are not the same as Russians. And when the war has started, despite the fact that for 2 years before the war, we, as Belarusian nation, we experienced huge level of repressions, tyranny and terror from Lukashenko's regime, people went to the streets for anti-war rally. Our Belarusian partisans started to disrupt railways to slow down Russian equipment, military equipment going to Ukraine. Thousands of Belarusian military volunteers joined Ukrainian army to defend Ukraine, because defending Ukraine, we are defending Belarus as well, because fate of Ukraine and fate of Belarus are intertwined. But I have to say that Belarus became the first victim of Russian aggression. But in our case, Lukashenko became a ally to Putin. He actually gave our country, he became collaborant, he became our country for Russia to invade Ukraine. And believe me, it's so shameful that Belarus is a country co-aggressor. And I remember how in 2022, it was so important for me not to lose relationship between Belarusians as nation and Ukrainians as nation, because they started to hate us, and it took us so long to explain that Lukashenko regime is one thing, Belarusians another. And only the facts that we are supporting and helping Ukrainians, for many months we have been providing internal information about bringing different jets, and missiles to Belarus, providing this information to Ukrainian army, helped us a lot. Belarusian refugees who fled repressions helped Ukrainian refugees a lot, because we feel what it means, to grab one child, grab one bag and leave your country, leaving everything behind. So we managed to keep our relationship. And since then, we advocated so much for Ukraine. And I really, encourage all the countries to help Ukrainians to win, because they are fighting not for their piece of land. They're fighting for all of us.
Well, thank you for that. And this is this incredibly important reminder that when we're against a regime, when we're against a dictator, Lukashenko is a great example of just a notorious individual, that we're not against the citizens of that country. We want to see them liberated. And so that's a good reminder for us. Would you tell us about the last election and your leadership of the opposition at this point?
So first of all, I have to say that language and how you name things are so important. You call us opposition. To be opposition in democratic world, it's normal. It's like opposition party. But in Belarus, we are not opposition. We are people who are fighting dictator. We are majority of people. Dictator has his personal security apparatus. They have brutality. They managed with the help of Putin to suppress us, but we are majority. Call us, please, democratic forces. It's really, important for us. So I saw number 30 here. Yesterday, it was 30 years that Lukashenko is in power in Belarus. We haven't felt democracy for 30 years. We forgot what it means, to choose your leader. And I know how hot debates now in America about Trump or, about Biden and Trump, your future elections. And it's such a luxury not to know who will be your next president. For 30 years, we knew who will be the next. And 2020 wasn't exclusion. We knew that, Lukashenko will do everything possible, to stay in the power, but it was such a massive uprising. Maybe we were too naive, and thought that if Lukashenko will see how many of us, we are peaceful, we want democratic changes, he would give up. We underestimated brutality of this dictator. He unleashed the most brutal terror in Belarus, for all these 30 years. Millions were on the streets, and a huge repressive machine started to work. Thousands, tens of thousands of people went through Belarusian prisons. It's awful prisons. It's like KGB, like Gulag prisons, blue bodies. I remember those awful pictures. And at least 500,000 had to flee Belarus because of repressions. And these repressions, continue until now. So for 4 years, Lukashenko has been trying to make people be loyal to him again, to make people like him again, but he didn't manage. People of Belarus will never forget and forgive what he has done and what he's continuing to do with our country. He's actually selling Belarus to Russia at the moment. He committed many crimes against people. He hijacked airplane. He orchestrated migration crisis on the border. He dragged our country into the war. He participated in abduction of Ukrainian children from occupied territories. So he's criminal. And 4 years of brutal repressions, people are not giving up. Believe me, sometimes, I think that you might think that fight for democracy is very romantic. Wow, they're fighting for democracy. But believe me, this path, this fight, it is paved with pain and tears and sufferings and victims. And sometimes people are so disoriented. We don't know what else we can do, to release our people from prisons, to hold free and fair elections in Belarus. And what I know is that no one war and no one fight cannot be won without allies. And that's why, we are looking for allies among democratic countries all over the world. And I think that it's moral obligation of every free nation to help those who are fighting for the same values and the same freedoms you are enjoying every day.
This point that you made about it is not glamorous to be fighting for freedom in these situations. We hear that every day here because we host people who are refugees from Cuba. We host people here from Vietnam. Last week, I had someone here from North Korea who had defected as a teenager, and we consistently hear that story. It is not some sort of glamorous thing. It is pain and suffering. It's people in prison. It's torture, etc. Would you say something about this longer legacy of communism in your country and how it's brought us to this point of tyranny?
Of course, communism influenced Belarus a lot, but what happened with my country is that Lukashenko, whom we chose, in 1994, he was populist, and he managed to persuade Belarusians that he will make our country economically blossoming, so on and so forth. But he was the most pro-communistic, pro-Soviet Union, pro-Russian person, in Belarus. And he is developing heritage of communism. What we had what we had in the past during communism, we had process of Russification. I will quote Nikita Khrushchev. Maybe you have heard, about this leader. He said that if we gave up our Belarusian language, we would come to communism faster. And they ruined, while in Soviet Union, they ruined everything Belarusian, They wanted to erase everything Belarusian from Belarus. Lukashenko is doing the same. For 30 years of his governance, he closed many Belarusian-speaking schools. They switched Belarusian language education to Russian language education. Now, after 2020 and after 2022, they together with Putin, they rewriting our history. They exclude our common European heroes from our historic books and put their Russian heroes. Second, it's mass repressions. In Stalin's time, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians, were intellectuals and farmers. They were or shot or sent to Gulag. Just in one night in 1937, NKVD killed 100 artists, poets, scientists, politicians, people from elites. This is what's going on now, repressions. Lukashenko wants to kill and ruin like everything alive, best people from civil society. Anti-Western agenda. After World War II, Soviet Union found new enemy. They called it collective West. Now they're doing the same. NATO wants to invade Belarus. This rotten West want to spoil Belarusians. They need our soils. This is their narratives, at the moment, and this heritage of communism. Economy. Communists replaced private property with state ownership, which belonged to main party. Lukashenko privatized, all Belarusian enterprises, the biggest one, and they serve only to Lukashenko's family, and we almost don't have very well-developed private business. And of course, it's a dictatorship itself, because for 70 years, we had no experience with democracy. We don't know how was the feeling really to choose your leader. It was appointed by party in Soviet Union. Now Lukashenko, he has pocket parliament. He's appointing people loyal to him, and this is what they call parliament. It's not about parliament. So, believe me, democracy. This is what we have to study. We have to learn how it is to live in democracy. And this is, for 4 years of our fight. Of course, we are trying to weaken the regime, but also it's necessary to strengthen civil society and to show what democracy is. It's rather difficult to live under democracy, because you have to listen to millions, of opinions and find consensus. And now I'm asking my comrades, my compatriots, not to quarrel, but to debate. It's two different things, so yeah. And but we have to get rid of this dictatorship habits, not to feel responsibility for anything. He knows better, he decides. No, it's our responsibility for the future of our country.
And you use the term repression. So would you tell us about the plight of political prisoners in Belarus?
No, of course, it's the most painful topic, for us, because a fight for democracy, it might be endless if not for political prisoners, because they are our friend, our beloved. My husband is one of them, and we don't have time. That's why we encourage democratic world to be faster, to be more decisive, because every day people are dying in Belarusian prisons. Every day can be the last, for my husband. I don't know about my husband for more than 1 year. We had to learn new word incommunicado mode. It means that a person is kept in full isolation. Lawyer is not allowed to visit people who are incommunicado. Letters are not delivered to them, and their letters are not delivered to us. I suppose that my husband doesn't have even paper and pen to write something. It's so humiliating to be prisoner in Belarus, and even more humiliating to be political prisoner, because their lives is it's constant physical and moral humiliation. Political prisoners are marked with special yellow labels like Jewish people during World War II. And it means that these people have to be treated much, much, much worse than other prisoners. That other prisoners cannot talk to them, to keep them in isolation. We can't talk about communicating to our political prisoners. No phone calls, no letters. It's so humiliating when you have to ask toilet paper. You have to beg administration to give you toilet paper or toothbrush, or if you have some pain, you have to beg about medicine assistance, and you often deny it. We already have 6 victims. 6 people died among political prisoners because they didn't get any medical assistance, for their diseases. So it's like, it's and so I don't know what to do with this situation, because we are working with many human rights defending organizations, with government and with Red Cross, with Vatican, trying to find ways, venues, how to help political prisoners who are in prisons, how to send mission to see if our people are alive. Nothing works. And it doesn't work because regime doesn't feel necessity to release people or to talk about them. That's why we need to create more pressure on the regime, more isolation, to send clear signal that we will be with Belarusian nation, with Belarusians, until every political prisoner is released.
Would you tell us, just in closing first, a little bit about what your husband was accused of? Why was he put in prison in the first place? And then any final remarks that you'd like to make to this group today?
No, my husband started as an ordinary YouTube blogger. He was driving from city to city, from village to village, asking people about their feelings, how they feel about our country, what the economic situation. He saw ruined collective farms. He saw that many cities are not looked after properly by government of the city. So, and he became so popular because, believe me, people of Belarus have never been asked their opinion, and the person appeared who coming to them and asking, what are you feeling? What do you think? And he became very popular. And people started to ask him, could you please become a candidate on the future presidential election? And he agreed. And the next day, after he declared that I'm going to participate in elections, he was detained. And, at that moment, I was, ordinary housewife. I was raising up 2 children, but out of love to my husband, I wanted to show him that what he has been doing was so important for me that I stood instead of him and gave my documents, and they registered me as a candidate for president. And this is how my path started. And since then, my husband is in prison for more than 4 years already. He was accused first on organizing rallies. It was it's funny because it was rally promoting me, as candidate. It was registered as rally, but they detained him. Then he was detained. He was accused of incitement to hatred. I have to write it down because it's nonsense things. Maybe he was accused in treason. I don't remember. It was 6, 7, maybe 10 accusation. And he was sentenced to 19.5 years in jail. I don't even look into this accusation because it's all, it's out of law. I myself was sentenced to 15 years in absentia. They given these terms 15, 20, 25 years in jail, for supporting political prisoners or for supporting Ukraine. When you donate to Ukrainian army, €5, 5 years in jail. This is their cost. So it's still accusation, and again, we absolutely don't have this normal judicial system. In Belarus, all the judges and prosecutors, they have to show loyalty to this regime. Actually, back in 2020, many lawyers have been deprived of their licenses because they protected political prisoners. So they were not loyal enough to Lukashenko's regime. So it's like my personal pain, my husband. But I know that thousands of people behind the bars, it's women and men, it's minorities, it's people with diabetes, special needs, heart attacks, people who don't get any medical assistance. And, again, we have to do everything possible to release them. And it can be done only through pressure. Believe me, dictators cannot be re-educated. Dictators cannot be appeased. Dictators can be only fought. And here we need strong democratic allies to fight with dictators, because dictators, sometimes they see undecisiveness or slowness of democratic world in making decisions, and they perceive this undecisiveness as weakness. Believe me, dictators don't respect democracy, and they're testing you. They're testing how far they can go until there will be response, how many red lines they can cross until they get response. So I believe in democracy. I really believe in people in democratic countries, that you also feel responsibility, not only for your wonderful America or wonderful, democratic countries you live in, but also for those who are fighting for the same values.
Well, I think that during this time, on the one hand, we've been prodded to be thankful with that aphorism that it's a luxury to not know who your next president will be. We do have a lot to be thankful for here in the United States and in the West. And second, I think you've inspired us to see another national patriot who wants what's best for all the people of our country. So would you help me in thanking our guest? Thank you very much.
Always with me. Thank you.
Our second panel today is looking where we are and looking ahead, and with a specific focus on Ukraine. And I'm delighted today that a longtime leader here in Washington, D.C., well-known writer and political commentator, David Keene, will be leading this panel as our moderator. Let me make sure that, if you don't mind, passing one of the mics to David, as he's going to be the one. There's one right there in the middle. If you don't mind passing that, and I'm going to let him go ahead and kick off this panel. David, thank you very, very much. You sure can.
Okay. People tell me that the world's a complicated place, but at heart, I've always thought that it's fairly simple to explain if you just understand that human beings are divided into roughly two groups. One group consists of people who want to live their lives, raise their families, take care of their children, and enjoy the freedom that comes with that. The other group is made up of people that want to tell the first group how to live their lives, raise their families, treat their children, and all of the other things that they might be able to control. If you find yourself in a homeowners association with one of the other group in it, that can be annoying. The same can be true if that person is on the city council in your city, but if that person somehow finds it himself or herself to become the head of the government, things get pretty bad pretty quickly, because people who like power, want power, enjoy exercising power, want more. And they want to make sure that they've got everything to say about what everyone else does. Now, over time in history, they've come by many names. You can call them what you want: communists, Nazis, all of the rest. But basically, if you think about it, isn't it really those two kinds of people that we need to worry about? And the people that find themselves in a country that is under the control of some of these people are captive. The captive nations were captive not just because the Hitler-Stalin Pact turned them over to another country run by that kind of person, but because they quickly installed the same kind of people in all of those countries, and freedom disappeared. I want to begin, before we turn it over to the others, with a couple of observations. First of all, Paula did observe the role that her father played. Lev Dobryansky was a wonderful human being and a fighter for freedom and a believer in freedom like no one that I've ever met. He was a good friend. One of the accomplishments he made, obviously, to raise a daughter in which he instilled the same values that he fought for his entire life. The other thing I'd like to observe as we begin is that we were hoping that Lee Edwards might be able to join us today. This building, this foundation, this museum, a lot of what happened during the early days of the Captive Nations movement is attributable to Lee Edwards. And when we think of it, we should thank him every time. He's having health problems now, as we all do or will. But the fact is that this, in many ways, is a tribute to everybody who's fought communism over the years, but it's also a tribute to what Lee Edwards has done for the lifetime of helping to lead that movement. You know, Lev and the founders of the Captive Nations movement and Captive Nations Week and the rest were adamant in believing two things. One, that it was important that we understand what was going on in those countries and not forget it, not let it pass. And secondly, that it was vitally important that the people in those countries who not only dreamed of freedom, but were willing to fight for it. And you could get this from talking to anybody who came out, found the fact that they got news that there were people on the outside who understood and cared was incredibly, incredibly helpful to them, because it kept their spirits up so that they could engage, hopefully at some point, in the fight they would have to. They knew that in all of these countries, they knew that if they were going to throw off the shackles of totalitarianism, it was their job to do that. But it was very helpful to know that there were people in the world who understood what they were facing and would help if they could. I think that's incredibly important, because the people in those countries, whether it was the Soviet Union or Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia or any of these countries, they knew what they were living under. We didn't have to tell them. I use two examples, and I'll get to the speakers. In 1968, on Independence Day, a friend of mine and I, who was at that point spending 6 weeks driving through the Soviet Union, were in Kiev. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a pounding on our door. And there were 4 medical students from Ghana who said they heard there weren't many tourists in Kiev in 1968. They'd heard that we were there. It was July the 4th, and they were there to help us celebrate. So we spent the day with these students. And then at the end of the day, we'd gotten pretty friendly. And I said, you know, I asked the elder of them, I said, you know, I got to ask you a question, because you're here studying in the Soviet Union for some years, and your country, Ghana, has just had a revolution. And in Nkrumah, the pro-Soviet ruler was gone. When you go home, you're going to be part of the country's elite. And are you worried about what's going to happen to you now that you're on the other side? And the student looked at me and laughed. He said, you know, a lot of African students who study abroad go home as communists. Those would be the ones who study in the United States and Britain. He said, I have never met a fellow African who studied for any time at all in the Soviet Union who went back home as a communist. I thought about that, and that made a lot of sense. In a couple of years before that, I had been in Vietnam and had spent several months traveling through the country with my guide, who became a good friend and had been Ho Chi Minh's deputy foreign minister during the battle against the French. He thought they were fighting for independence. When Ho Chi Minh took over North Vietnam, he found out that wasn't what it was all about. So he fled to the south and became the PSYOPs leader of the South Vietnamese army. But we were having a drink one evening after we'd gone through whatever we did that day. And he said, you know, communism is like a fire across the river. It really looks pretty good. But when it gets to you, you find out it's a fire from hell. And he was explaining how they were able to recruit Viet Cong, you know, there. My point is that they knew. They knew in Poland, they knew in all these other countries, they knew what they were living under. They didn't know if they could get out of it, but they were looking for a way. And the importance of the Captive Nations movement was it showed them that there were people there. I have a friend from Canada who I fish with, and I knew he'd been in politics, but this was in our earlier incarnations. And one day somebody gave me a book about what they call Black Ribbon Day. In the book, the author said that without him, Black Ribbon Day would never have happened. And he was the guy that initiated the movement that ended up in, I think, 1988 with 2 million people in the Baltics holding hands in the largest anti-communist demonstration that had ever taken place. And by the 1980s and in today, don't underestimate what happens when that kind of thing takes place, because it shakes even the most power-mad dictator in the world, because he knows that within the confines of whatever country it is he's ruling, he's got a lot of those same kind of people, and he's got to worry about it. So I just wanted to point out how important I think all of this sort of thing is. But with that, let me turn it over. And I'm notoriously unable to pronounce Smith correctly. And Taylor is a little harder. But what I'm going to do is at this point turn it over to Bill Taylor, is at the Institute of Peace and a former ambassador to Ukraine.
David, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Eric, thank you for having me. Bruce Weinrod asked me to go. I appreciate Bruce's invitation as well. So victims of communism, and we're talking about Ukraine. Ukrainians are victim of Russian communism, and the extent of the victimhood goes back all the way from the beginning, all the way to the beginning of that. And we remember that some 4 million Ukrainians, at least 4 million Ukrainians, estimates go as high as 8 million, were starved to death by Joe Stalin. Intentionally. This was an intentional act of starvation, of killing Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, as we know, people in this room know the Holodomor, and they remember this now. They weren't able to talk about that. The whole time of the Soviet Union, communism, no one could talk about that. The Ukrainians were also victims of Russian communism when Chernobyl exploded. And the Russians, the Soviets in Moscow, would not acknowledge it, and so that was on the 26th of April. And on the 1st of May, as we all know, they have May Day, and they have big parades. And so Moscow told the Ukrainians, go ahead with that parade. And so there were children in the streets, and they were exposed to that radiation. So my point is, the Ukrainians know about being victims of communism. Ukrainians know about being victims of Russian colonialism. So for 300 years, the Russian, the Tsars, before the Soviet Union, colonized Ukraine. And Ukrainians tried to have their own language and their own culture, their own history, their own heroes, and the Russians wouldn't have it. They colonized that. So the victims, the Ukrainians were also victims today of Russian fascism. That's what they're fighting today. This invasion in 2014, of course, when it started, when the Russians first invaded Ukraine and Crimea and Donbass, and then in 2022, this massive invasion that the Russians have inflicted on Ukraine with no justification, no rationale, and still have not been able to say why they invaded. So the Ukrainians have been victims of Russian communism, of Russian colonialism, and Russian fascism today. And so that's it. So the common theme there, it's Russia. This is the problem. We heard President Tikhanovskaya talking about that as well. I call her president because she is the elected president. That's the problem. It's Russia. When you live next to the Russians, Bruce Weinrod talked earlier about the NATO expansion, and NATO expanded not because NATO tried to pull nations into that organization. No, the Poles and the Hungarians and the Czechoslovakia at the time, and then the Baltics later on looked at where they were. They were suddenly free, and they looked where they lived, and it was next to Russia. And that suggested to them they were not going to be secure. And they applied, just exactly as Bruce talked about, to NATO. So that's where we are now. And so NATO summit right now, trying to convince the Ukrainians that they will be in, and the Ukrainians want to be in that organization for the same reason that the other nations have joined. Let me stop there and we'll turn it off. I'm done for now. I got 2 minutes, right? I told 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, we can, Margus Sarglev, who is Deputy Chief of Mission at the Estonian Embassy, is next. And I was there when they were running around announcing that they were going to have a referendum to confirm the Constitution back right after it was passed. And I remember going to what had been a collective farm in February. It was very cold. And what had happened is that many of the former communists had just reinvented themselves, and this guy had sold off all the equipment. And I remember in the library where everybody was shivering, they said, we have to have another election. We have to have a referendum. And this little old lady said, we don't need a referendum. We need to shoot the mayor.
Well, thank you, David, for this introduction. I was thinking of what could I add to all of that has been said before. Of course, I would first like to thank you for the invitation to be here, Dr. Patterson, Ambassador Voss. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be part of all the events that Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation puts on. Maybe just a sort of a personal story. In 2014, I was posted to the Estonian embassy in India. So I was far removed, and I followed the news as one does about the events unrolling in Ukraine. You would read about little green men appearing in Crimea. Then there would be these spontaneous demonstrations, the seizure of the local parliament and the centers of power, a spontaneous referendum that requested Crimea to be accepted into the Russian Federation, and then the alleged annexation. Now, having grown up in Estonia and having heard all the stories and from my grandparents and reading it in the history books, this is almost one-to-one what happened in Estonia in 1939 and 1940. The Russians and the Soviets were still using the same playbook all these years later. I was born in 1977. So I was about 12, 13 years old when the Soviet Union started to crumble. So I have some recollection of what the Soviet regime was. For all its high ideals, I can assure you it was not the communism that was preached. It was plain and simple imperialist regime that had taken over my country and many others. I think with the further invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we finally see all the masks fall. Current Russian regime is also about imperialist expansion, and they're cooperating with other like-minded countries in the world that are illiberal, very much like the people and the homeowners association. Yes. So what the threat that we're facing globally is that of, it is a competition of ideas or ideals, but not that of capitalism versus communism. And perhaps this is not the right audience to say this, but I don't think it ever was. It is a question of a competition between liberty and the ideals of liberty that we espouse, and that of illiberal imperialist expansion. The third idea that I wanted to point out is NATO as the most successful defensive alliance in the recent history, at least. Far be it from me to contradict Ambassador Taylor, but we heard just recently that words do matter. I would refrain from talking about NATO expansion, but rather would talk about NATO enlargement. The process of, for example, my country acceding to NATO was arduous. We had to convince people against their own judgment that we were worthy enough, we were developed enough, we were true believers in these liberal ideas that we could be admitted. It was no small feat. Over the past 20 years that Estonia has been both a member of the European Union and NATO, we have prospered. Estonia tops the charts when it comes to freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of economic freedom. And if I were to toot my own horn, we also punch above our own weight in terms of contribution to our collective security. And I say that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland are prime examples what can and will happen when you have a stable, secure environment that led by a government that espouses liberal ideas. And this is the path and the future that I hope for and believe that will be possible for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more before we open it up to questions. Shonda Strader, is I got it?
Almost.
Close enough. Huh?
Yeah.
Yes. Who's a research fellow and lecturer in Russian strategic and military studies at the Baltic Defense College. Take it on.
Thank you so much. I think being here in Washington, D.C. during the 75th anniversary of the NATO alliance is a very special moment for me. I started my professional career in 2006 when I was working with Riga NATO Summit. That was 2 years after the Baltic states joined NATO. And then I was responsible for organizing the Young Leaders Forum. Paul Johnson was a young leader, then now he's a defense minister and is deciding on the support to Ukraine. Currently, Jan Havranek who was sitting in the chair before. He was also a young leader and has spent many years doing great job to support the freedoms and ideals Visegrad countries and the Baltic countries have shared forever. And during these days, of my first days of employment at the Latvian Transatlantic Organization, it was really interesting to sense and feel the sense of shared identity with Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, and the others. And it was interesting that those foreign policy and security experts from Czechia or Slovakia or Hungary, they were talking about the Prague Spring, about 9/11, and how all these events brought together their societies and the United States and everyone else to fight for the same ideals. And the Baltic states have always been there, and I think we have also this shared identity with Ukraine, also with the Belarusian society and the others. And I think like when we were in Tbilisi and on a minivan back from very nice resort to discussion venue, we had a wonderful discussion and arguments with Ukrainian society, how great leaders they are, that they will stay in the country, they will fight for the ideals, they will fight for the freedoms that we all share. And I think with many Ukrainians, we share this common sense and identity even now. And it was interesting for me to observe multiple panels and discussions that were held at the NATO Public Forum, where one very interesting idea didn't escape me at all about the fear that we share in the United States, not about the presidential election alone, but about higher electricity bills or rising prices or inflation. In Germany, it is basically the supply of grain, food prices, and electricity bills. If you go further to the east, in East and Central Europe, it is basically the health of our military industry. And Czechia organized this great initiative to buy ammunition for Ukraine that it badly wants now. And we know defense is very practical, but the fear Ukrainian society faces currently is completely different, and it is fear of dying while they are ready to pay the ultimate price for the freedoms that we all enjoy here. And the reaction of multiple countries, is like, and the supply of what Ukraine needs now, because security is very practical. And it was interesting to observe that, those statements that came out of the NATO summit, sometimes many Ukrainians were holding their breath that Americans are sending long-range missiles, but to Germany. It is almost like I'm completely thirsty and I need some water, but Americans are coming and giving to someone else. And you cannot use them for deep strikes against Russia, of course, while Russians are killing Ukrainians without any kind of discrimination. Then there's Germany that is reluctant to give Taurus missiles. And some diplomats from Central Eastern Europe have referred to the major reason that German military finds others incapable of operating their missiles, launching them. And they are saying that we cannot send the missiles, we have to send the German military to Ukraine too. That's kind of like obscure, considering the fact that Ukraine military is fully capable to fly F-16s and defend the country and the world order that we all enjoy. And then actually what is required from us to support Ukraine, to do the right thing for Germany, who has been Nazi and communist for multiple years, and they should be capable of getting past this sense of guilt, historical guilt, and to finally be on the right side of the history. That is something that has been a no-brainer for Czechs, Latvians, Estonians, Poles, anyone, all the countries living from Baltic Sea to Black Sea. And imagine in what kind of situation were we if the Ukrainian government and the society were weak and Ukraine had collapsed in the first days of the war. It means Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Poland would live with Russia as a neighbor, and Russia would have Ukraine as a source for the further expansion. And then we would be way more unprepared to defend the liberal democratic world order that has actually created, those authoritarian tyrants in China, North Korea, and Russia. that we must face now. So we have to look at the fault lines that and the different errors that reside in the liberal democratic order, U.S. foreign policy, the foreign policy of the West. If the U.S. Congress is debating for 7+ months the military support of Ukraine, which is only 1/2 bigger than the sales of toys in the United States in 2024, I think there's something wrong with the ideals and the values that we all share. Thank you.
Thank you. We have here 3 people and one who doesn't know much, but 3 people who probably know as much about what's going on in the Ukraine-Russian war and in the area and the consequences. So the first question has been on everybody's mind since the war started, and that was, once the war starts, when and how does it ever end? And of course, during the course of most wars, you don't know that. But the question is, how do you envision this war ending, and what kinds of things will be left behind in terms of, there's first the question of who comes across as the victor, of course, but also what does Ukraine, what's going to be there, the infrastructure, the political arrangements, the integrity. The United States has always had the advantage that we go to war with people that are 1,000 miles away. But as you pointed out, these guys live next door to each other and they're not close friends. So that's a harder thing to resolve. And the question is, do you have any thoughts as to how that might be done?
I'm glad to take a shot at that. I'm glad to take a shot at that, but my colleagues here will also have views living closer than that. But yes, wars end when one side wins.
Right. Not always, but usually.
Oh, well, except for the Korean War, but one side wins. And so if Russia wins, and Sanders has already talked about the problems if Russia wins, Ukraine needs to win this war. And we need to support them for all the reasons that we've talked about. And we're doing that. NATO summit is last 2 days have made real commitments to supporting Ukraine and allowing them over time, both militarily and otherwise, to be able to push the Russians back. I mean, all the Ukrainians want to win this war. All they want is to get the Russians out of the country. This is not complicated. Just get the Russians out of Ukraine. This is what, and again, militarily, yes, we know they can do that if we support them. And yes, it took 7 months. It's outrageous. It took 7 months to do that. And we should remove these restrictions. If we continue the level of support that we're, or more, and if we take the restrictions off, then the Ukrainians can win this war. The Ukrainians can win this war. We need to support them as they do that. That's how it wins.
I would echo the sentiment. All wars end in negotiations, and we have to do all collectively to put Ukraine at a situation where they can negotiate from a position of strength. I think President Tsikhanouskaya made a reference to the fact that or somebody else earlier at a panel, that the Russian invasion of 2014 and 2022 are very different in that the Russians faced a very different Ukrainian army. I was still stationed in Kyiv in the early part of 2021 in April, when Russians first amassed their troops on Ukraine's borders. And the sentiment in Kyiv was, bring it on. We're not afraid of them. And it is, I would say it's perverse, the high price that the Ukrainians have to pay for defending their freedom and our freedom, but they're not batting an eye. They will do it as long as it takes. Now, our job is to make sure that it won't take terribly much longer. what is it for us that Ukraine and Russia are fighting this war? There are some voices in the world saying this is a regional conflict, and why don't we just sit down and talk about it? My prime minister has time and again talked about the reasons, some of the personal reasons why Estonians feel affinity to the plight of Ukrainians, the oppression, the repressions that Ukrainians in the occupied territories where there's no fighting going on are facing. The peace that arrived in Estonia at the end of the Second World War cannot be compared to the peace that arrived in, say, France or England. We were left behind the Iron Curtain and did not enjoy the freedom and liberties that a free society does. That is the human plight. But over and beyond that, what this fight is about are the principles of international rules-based system. Russia has launched a war of aggression, which we collectively decided at the close of the Second World War that this is illegal. And if Russia prevails, the war of aggression will be justified as a means of international politics. And we don't have to look to the Straits to see that they're trigger-happy folks sitting in some capitals. There are a number of other examples all across the globe where we can see that if we allow for this to become legitimized as a means of statecraft, it is a world that I personally don't want to live in.
I guess how will Russia know it's lost? I mean, you know, Stalin, bullheaded as he was, when everybody was being killed in Finland in 1939, decided the game isn't worth the candle, I'm withdrawing. Is Putin more bullheaded than Stalin, or is he not suffering the kind of embarrassment that Stalin did?
Those are really interesting questions. I remember reading about Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union and the events in Czechoslovakia in February of 1953, when the Soviet Stalinists executed perfectly cool government that wanted to make best conditions for Czechs and Slovaks to enjoy social economic benefits like from the cooperation and really build a welfare state within the Warsaw Pact. And it is interesting that, you know, Ukraine at some point made the same choice, but to integrate closer with Europe, which led to the Russian aggression in 2014. So Ukraine really wanted to be like Canada, and Russia had full possibilities to be like the United States with natural resources, endowments, quite capable human capital, very peaceful borders, like from the west to the east. It had all the possibilities to choose a normal path if it was a normal country, but it is intrinsically aggressive, corrupt, and all the ideas and demons like communism and empire and the willingness to take back everything that was ostensibly lost to the collapse of the Soviet Empire or the Russian Empire. Those are the ghosts that, you know, it's like we know that Russia will not change in 100 years. When the war ends, you know, it's like there will be no victors. Like we will have to think about how we reconstruct Russia, and probably we will need much more than a couple of years of the spending that the Americans are spending on toys, and Europeans too. We have to chip in too, and of course we will be doing this. We have to really focus on the right things, not how we do things, and we really have to focus on Ukraine now. First, military aid to make sure that it doesn't fall to Putin, and only very rapid, substantial support from Europe and the United States, primarily from France and Germany, because those countries, in terms of military support, could do more. if Gerhard Schroeder is criticizing the government of Olaf Scholz, then he has to do opposite whatever he's doing. And this is the right thing. This is the thing that would keep Germans on the right side of history, and we have to be on the right side of history. What are the repercussions? And today at NATO Public Forum, I saw young Ukrainian lady. She has traveled long distance from Ukraine by train, by bus to Poland, then multiple connections to get to the NATO summit, to hear the discussions that the NATO is standing for the people that enjoy the freedom, democratic values, everything Ukrainians enjoy too. But then they are not in the alliance, and we are self-deterring ourselves, to do the right thing. And she was wearing a very nice and in those difficult times, Ukrainians are wonderful people and they do wonderful things. But she was wearing a little bag, and she said that more than sex, she would enjoy the death of Putin. And I hope that the Ukrainian youth could turn to the normal things and not dream about the death of Putin, and enjoy their lives and the freedoms and the prosperity and the safety of the kids and the women and the men returning to their daily duties, not fighting an evil empire.
Additional questions? We're here. Either one of you. Fight it out and then decide.
This will be our last question.
Pardon?
This will be our last question.
Okay.
I did write them down, but I'm Andy Rapita. I'm a proud supporter of the EOC, and we've seen a lot lately, especially since about a year ago after the invasion, where there's been a lot of commentators, if not now, we're seeing basically propagandists, people like Tucker Carlson and others. They're basically saying that we're supporting Ukraine in that fight is a waste of time, a waste of money. And some of these commentators and some politicians right here in town are borderline praising the Russian regime. And it's now, and this propaganda is now spreading. It's spreading to places where I never thought it would be, where people who 40 years ago said Reagan was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Reagan wouldn't recognize them now. So what are your strategies that you can think of to combat this insanity?
Well, this would be a question of how do you handle the case publicly, which is important. One thing we don't do in this country is we don't accuse people that disagree with our policies as traitors. Sometimes we claim they are, but since Woodrow Wilson, we haven't really done that. And that didn't go well for the First Amendment in this country. But if you're involved in a long-term war or long-term anything in a democratic country, then you better have a way to make sure that the public that has to ultimately decide whether the politicians who are running that are right have a case that deserves support, or you fail. So the question I think is, how effective, or how do you think the selling, and I'm not using that word, in a pejorative sense, but the selling of the strategy and the need for it is going?
A majority of Americans agree with what we've said here. When you ask Americans, whether it's in polls, I speak a lot, I go to a lot of towns and cities and states around this country. I have these conversations. Polls say the same thing. When you ask Americans if they support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, they say yes. 2/3. I mean, we're talking about 60, 65% if you do the polls, but even just talking to individuals, that's what we get. That's number one. Number two, that's reflected in our Congress, turns out. This last $61 billion that took 7 months to finally get passed with bipartisan support, both the House and the Senate, which reflects this strong support for Ukraine and for NATO, by the way, in the American people. So it's there, but we have to make the case. exactly the case. And there are a couple of cases and that's the only way we can do it. I mean, there are a lot of loud voices, and you've mentioned a couple of them, that will parrot the kind of the Russian line, the Kremlin line. And we know it's not true, but we have to say it. We have to talk to people. We have to have this conversation. We have to make the point that what kind of world do you want to live in? You want to live in a world where some big nation that has nuclear weapons, or even is just stronger than its neighbors, can invade and take territory, take 60%, take 20% or more of the neighbors' territories? Is that kind of world that any nation around the world, much less the United States, wants to live in? No. That's number one. The second one we've made, the point has been made that if Russia is allowed to take Ukraine, and Russia is on the border then of NATO, as it is already in the Baltic states and in Finland, but if it's right smack up against Poland and American troops, then Americans in these towns that I talked in, and the people that respond to these polls, they recognize that that's a threat to us. That's a threat to us, that we will be, if the Russians go into Ukraine, they don't stop. I mean, they are, they're aggressive. This is why these nations wanted to join NATO, because they recognize that the Russians don't stop unless they run up against NATO. They've been afraid to attack NATO, and that is because NATO's strong, and they know that the Russians know they would lose. So that the argument that is, number one, it's in our interest, and number two, it's a world we want to live in. There's a moral argument. I mean, we've talked about how the Russians have gone in to Ukraine and have tortured and have assassinated and have murdered and have raped and have kidnapped children, Russian children. The president talked about this, talking about taking children. So Putin is an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court for these exact. There's a moral argument that can't be allowed. That precedent, that legitimization of going in and murdering civilians, attacks on this hospital 2 days ago. They intentionally targeted a hospital for children with cancer. That has to, and it does. This is one of the reasons Americans support the Ukrainians and support NATO and its.
Okay, we got about half a minute left for you.
Good.
So only in addition to what Ambassador Taylor said, I have had the privilege of also to travel within the United States, perhaps not quite as quite as widely, but the private and public conversations that I've had are pointing to the same direction, that there is a wide-based support for Ukraine. But some of the points that we try to make as Estonians, first of all, Ukraine seems far away, but we have to realize, even sitting here in DC, that Estonia or Ukraine is not as distant from the US as one would think. It's just one country over. Between Alaska and Ukraine, there's just one country. And the second one is that we're in this together. There are some critical voices directed at Europeans not doing enough. As an Estonian, I am pretty proud to say anywhere we can go, we say we're doing more than our share, and we're trying to inspire other nations to do the same.
And when he says that about Estonia, he's absolutely right. Now, we're going to end it right now. I just want one warning. Keep an eye on your homeowners association.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end today with brief remarks from the Ukrainian World Congress. So allow me to introduce to you our distinguished final guest to close us out. Before as she's coming, let me just note that we do have a reception in the salon following this event. And by the way, for those who are watching this on video in the future, and you keep hearing these what sounds like ambulances or police cars go by, it's because of the NATO summit, and the White House is a block away, and it's all of these dignitaries traveling around with motorcades. We're not having an emergency yet. So without further ado, would you help me welcome Marta Farion?
Thank you. Thank you for your kind remarks. And I'm very honored to be able to be here with you. On behalf of the Ukrainian World Congress, the president of the Congress, Paul Grod, was not able to be here today. He had to leave last night, and he asked me to appear on his behalf. By the way, there are 20 million Ukrainians outside of Ukraine living right now. Over 10 million are in Russia. And they're not refugees. They are the people that have been living in Russia for many, many years. And obviously right now, their organizations have been closed. Many of them have been arrested. And that's what happens with them. But the other 10 million are in many, many other countries. So we have our ambassadors, our civil society ambassadors all over the world. And I want to thank all of you for the work you're doing in this organization, which is now as important as when it was created, and even more important right now at this time of crisis. So every Ukrainian has family members who were victims of communism. And since we heard some of the personal stories, I'll just mention very briefly. I come from a Ukrainian family whose my parents, my grandparents, their kids, their brothers and sisters, their nephews and nieces were sent to Siberia. Many of them were killed. And so we are not different in my family than just about every Ukrainian family. So we have it in our DNA where we know exactly when there is disinformation that's being fed in the United States and throughout the world. We know exactly what Putin has in mind. And why aren't we believing what he said and he wrote? Just like Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and he laid out exactly what he's going to do, and that's what he did, and nobody believed it. Putin came out with a manifesto just a few years before he invaded Ukraine. And he wrote exactly what he intends to do. And that manifesto also included NATO. And he specifically mentioned NATO and the Western world as the enemy. That's why I personally, it's not a very politically astute thing to say, but I'm always in awe and surprised that there are people in very high positions, even in our political world, that are willing to repeat and enhance the messages of an enemy of the United States. I call that treason. I don't know how you call it, but it bothers me. Anyways, every person now hearing sirens of warning, everyone is aware of being a victim of Ukrainian attacks. And right now, I have a colleague here from Kyiv, from the University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, that just called her family in Ukraine and was told that there's bombing going on Kyiv right now. So definitely, Putin is sending a signal to all of us and to NATO. So we who are here, all of us, understand the brutal attacks on Ukraine right now, that they are a threat to all the former captive nations. And as the NATO alliance convenes in Washington, the fate of Europe's eastern and central front line hangs in the balance. From the Baltics to Belarus to Ukraine to the Caucasus, a new Iron Curtain has emerged as formerly captive nations are standing up to the Kremlin, and Ukraine fights for its very existence. And while NATO was formed as a fortress against communism in Europe, at the onset of the Cold War, the alliance now faces a similar threat. Will the free world continue to stand against the Kremlin's imperial aims, or will we enter an age of captive nations of Europe again? This captive nations summit has now acquired a very relevant urgency. This captive nations summit is calling out the dangers posed by the brutal Russian dictatorship. The current Russian threat remains by far the biggest security challenge that NATO countries have had to deal with since the end of the Cold War. Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Hello, didn't we pay attention? Today, he brutally attacks Ukraine and destabilizes other countries to achieve the goal of restoring Russia to the borders of the former USSR and expanding the Russian sphere of influence to Central and Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, this situation is not obvious to all Western leaders, despite Russia's clear demands on NATO, which it put forward in its ultimatum in December of 2021, immediately preceding his attack on Ukraine. And yet, even after 2 years, over 2 years of continuous devastated attacks on Ukraine, and the latest targeted intentional bombing of Ukraine's largest children's hospital in Kyiv, just days before the start of the summit, the NATO summit, Western countries still pretend that the war between Russia and Ukraine is a territorial dispute between the two countries, and that it does not pose a threat to them. I think they're slowly waking up. Putin is not interested in just the land. He is interested in eradicating the Ukrainian nation, in eradicating its identity, its history, its culture, and its independence. He wants Ukraine in his new Russian Union. For Ukraine, this is an existential threat. That is why Ukrainians surprised the world and repelled the Russian military for 2.5 years. And that is why Ukrainians will fight and will win this war. If you remember, everyone and all the world's leaders were ready to say, okay, this fight, Russia will take over Ukraine in 5 days. And guess what? We're at 2.5 years, and Ukrainians are fighting harder than ever. And I have no doubt that Ukraine will win this war for Ukraine and for the rest of the world. So the ruthless killings of innocent children and civilians is intended as a provocation to demonstrate that Putin will continue his violence and impunity because he believes that NATO and the West are in disarray and they lack the will to stop him. He is also sending a message to the other former Soviet republics as a warning. Take a good look, because this is what will happen to you if you oppose us. That is why the war against Ukraine has acquired an existential character also for Russia in an imperial way, and for Ukraine as a matter of life or death. And no peace agreement between Moscow and Kiev will guarantee that the war will not resume in a few years. An armistice will only provide Moscow time to rearm and attack again. The only way to stop the war in Ukraine is to provide Ukraine with the necessary weapons to defeat the enemy and close the sky, and to increase the price of Russian military aggression. In our system of international political order, the only realistic security guarantee is Ukraine's entry into NATO. But such a decision is impossible without a consolidated position by Western countries. So for the Western alliance, the stakes in Ukraine are higher than ever. The loss in Ukraine will be a loss for the West, and it will inevitably result in a complete change of political landscape in Europe, and it will result in the decline of the Euro-Atlantic alliances and the territory as we know it now. So the security alliance that has repeatedly proven its effectiveness and commitment to common values, NATO, cannot allow such a development. The task for us, the civil society and the experts in our countries, is to convey to our governments the threat to the security of our countries and to our people. With joint efforts, we in the Western world and the members of NATO must find the determination for a firm, clear, and effective response to the latest Russian threat. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak, to thank everyone for the support of Ukraine, and I congratulate you for the work that you've done all these years. Thank you.
Well, as we conclude, I remember the remarks that Ambassador Vosh made in the very first panel, in which she said it's vital that we teach true history. And so I would just ask you to consider doing one of a couple of things. The first is we have this wonderful resource right here in Washington, across the street from a metro, a block from the White House. Would you refer people or bring them here to see the museum? If they're your friends who are far away, they ought to come and visit you on vacation anyways. You can also point them to the many videos, witness videos, and other resources for teachers and students on our website. And of course, we're a 100% nonprofit. We're not a government institution. And so we'd gladly take your financial resources as well. Well, we're delighted that you could join us today. Could we conclude with just one more round of applause for these fantastic speakers? Thank you. That concludes our program. Thank you.